And welcome back. As we mentioned prior to our commercial break, we are embarking on a two-part conversation this morning with Lord Michael Ashcroft. He is joining us for the first time in a few months, right, sir?
Yeah. We're just talking about it's been 6 months.
It's been 6 months.
Yeah.
There we go. Good morning.
Good morning.
Lord Ashcroft.
Good morning.
Good morning. But
Yeah, so
great to be here in such a fantastic studio.
We're doing a little thing. We're trying. So, there's a lot we can get into this morning. I want for us to begin with a discussion on Belize from your perspective. The last time you were here with us was prior to the March 12th general elections. Some would say that a lot has happened since then in terms of the government and the direction in which the country is headed. So let's begin with your perspective as to what's been going on.
I think that could even take up the two sections and even talking about what has happened since the election. But I think at that time I was saying that the election was a foregone conclusion. In fact, I was recommending that people should keep their own money in their pocket and not donate to the political parties because of the chaos within the UDP. And as it turned out, I think there was a little bit of a surprise that the UDP even managed to get together and have 5 seats, even though the factions were divided between Tracy and Shine. Now, since then, of course, the UDP have got themselves into an almighty great mess, which to this day has not been sorted. Now, for me, it is always important in any country that there is a thriving democracy means an effective opposition. And opposition is often a combination between the main opposition party and the media, keeping the government to account.
Which they call the fourth state, the Fortis state.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And so now we have a situation with the fight with the PUP having absolute control. And I don't think I'm saying anything that any citizen doesn't know, but the level of naughtiness that is happening in the government today is very high indeed. And there is an old saying in history that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so I think it's very important that the UDP get their act together and together with the media hold this government to account with the vast majority that they have in the House, which even gives them the okay, if they wish to change Belize's constitution. So I think we're at a bit of a crossroads here as we go forward. And unless the UDP sorts itself out and becomes effective and brings in new talent, which is very important, because some of the dinosaurial politicians of the UDP need to stay out completely. Their time is up.
That's a fair observation. When you look at what's taking place within the United Democratic Party, and of course, this goes well before the March 12th general elections, that they've been infighting, and the fact that the party is factionalized, one would want to think that post March 12th, they would have a sober coming together and figuring out the way forward for the party. But it would seem as if though it's more confusion now than before. We saw the resignation of Shine Barrow a few days after he lost his seat in Mesopotamia. That succeeded the resignation of the chairman at the time. Both have since returned to office as party leader and as chairman respectively. And the confusion and the mayhem continues. Despite the High Court attempting to make certain clarifications on expulsions and what have you, it doesn't seem as if though the party is moving any forward.
No, and you have an MPC meeting this Saturday,
Yes.
which seems as though that's going to land up in chaos.
As the other 2 NPC meetings that were failed.
You see, the only way the UDP can get itself together is if there is an open election for the leader and an open election for who will be the representatives for the various constituencies around the country. And this is where the resistance is at the moment. Shine wants a future in politics. Tracy and many others do not want Shine to have a future in politics. And so you have oil and water here trying to mix in the same pot. And egos are running amok on the old established UDP at the moment. And they do say that in law, possession is 9/10 of the law. So they have the headquarters, they by law are the appointed representatives of the party, and they're doing everything they can to ensure that there is not a free choice for UDP supporters to decide who should be the leader. And until that is broken, this can go on for a long time.
What do you think of influential members that we recognize, older heads like the former Prime Minister and his take on what's taking place within the United Democratic Party? Do you believe that he has any type of influence at this point determining what step forward the UDP can make?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, if you go back, they have tried various forms of arbitration, but the stubbornness is there. I mean, for example, both sides believe they are acting within the Constitution.
Yeah.
And when you have a conversation with either side, they're accusing the other the whole time of breaking the Constitution. And I've had a good look at the judge's statement when he came out, and he has quite rightly said that both the convention last October that Tracy had was outside the Constitution, and that the expulsions were outside the legal power of the existing UDP. But what the judge did not say is what the remedy was. Now, from Tracy's side, there seems to be an assumption that that means they're back in. From the Shine side, it's got to go to a vote. And this weekend, so it's meant to be, is a vote that they are brought back in. That doesn't chime well to the Tracy side. And so to that extent, this may only be sorted by very expensive lawyers over a long period of time, unless heads can be banged together. And you talked about the former leader. I spoke to him this weekend. I spoke to about 8 people this weekend to try to understand what was going on here. And I came away just believing that reconciliation is close to impossible until one or the other backs down or really compromises.
That doesn't seem as if it's going to happen anytime soon. So my question is, do you believe that if, for argument's sake, Tracy's side decides to form its own political movement, its own party, that it stands a chance of being viable? We've seen third parties come and go, and they really can't establish themselves long enough to be formidable opponents in electoral politics.
I mean, I don't think, my personal view, if you go back to the statement that I said, that I like to see an effective opposition, then anything which starts to split the votes of one sector of the community inevitably leads to disaster and would probably give the PUP another term again. So right at the moment, there may be up to 4 years before an election. I just see this going on with a very costly legal battle until one side or the other gets exhausted. But a new party, for example, you can go out and find 32 good Belizeans wanting to change the future of politics. You know what happens here at election. It's not just in this country that the politicians are corrupt. The electorate is corrupt too. How many of the voters go and get their checks to vote for a party? And both parties turn a blind eye to what is absolute corruption of the democratic process in Belize.
Because they're a part of it.
Because they're part of it. So how does a third party both get the funds, and does it start to play that game and compete against, say, the PUP at the next election with millions and millions of money to pay off the voters. So you've got a cycle here in Belize that may be now too rotten to be able to cure.
And with the possibility of a third term for the current administration, what does that do for the health of democracy here in Belize? We've highlighted comments from the Prime Minister immediately after finding out that the People's United Party won a second term. And he spoke about ensuring that there weren't any representatives getting too comfortable feeling that this is an opportunity for them to collect resources for themselves. But as they are approaching a very high possibility of a third term, do we see the possibility of democracy in this country and the health of our administration weakening?
Well, you've only got to have a look at the redistricting.
Which is yet to be undertaken.
I tried to start that process. That the mandate for democracy of equality of numbers of voters per constituency is way out of whack. But the government worked very hard to ensure that it was not changed before the last election. Do you want to put some money on whether it's going to be changed in this term? But it should and must.
I don't mean to be cynical, but there's a degree of cynicism that should be applied here, because if you look back to what the Prime Minister said just before the March 12th general elections, that redistricting would be high on the agenda once they're given a second mandate. Well, we're several months in and there has been no talk of redistricting. As a matter of fact, my opinion, based on an observation, is that they're off to a rocky start. They had tension with the unions. We're looking at a budget that many were saying, okay, well, perhaps we're borrowing more than we're actually making. Is it viable or is it sustainable over a period of time? And I believe that those are legitimate questions for the populace of the Belizeans to ask. I don't know that at this point they're off to the races on a good foot. What is your take on that?
Well, you're going back to one of the comments I made very early on about effective opposition coupled with effective media, and media that needs to investigate what is going on here. Now, if you take some of the other areas here, where is the Senate inquiry on Portico? The government managed to push it into the long grass and it's been abandoned.
Well, it fell apart in spectacular fashion too.
Yeah. So, and if you take some of the laws that we have here, whether it's the Contractor General, whether it's the Ombudsman, whether it's the freedom of information, they're all shallow and non-enforceable. They're only optical to satisfy the Western governments that we have the appropriate legislation to check for corruption in public life. But they are toothless.
Speaking of unions that Isani just highlighted and some of the challenges that the Briceño administration currently finds themselves with battling against unions, one of the big conversations right now is wages. Wages where union members from several different parts of society feel that they deserve higher pay, and they've deserved it for a very long time. Do you believe that the government finds itself in a pickle in providing that salary increase or salary adjustment, as some of them call it, while also ensuring that they have fiscal stability as well?
Well, I mean, that is not unique to Belize. I mean, it's even the same in the United Kingdom, where unions are pressing for significant wage increases, and that won't change. It is always a delicate balance between the growth of the economy, the amount of wages that are paid. I mean, that will happen all the time, but. You know, if you go back to the Bulmer report that talks about the fact that over the last 20 years there's hardly been any growth, that there is a growing inequality in Belize, that the rich get richer, the poor stay where they are. And of course, the government will always argue that we've had tremendous growth this year. but as someone once said, statistics are manipulated by political parties throughout the world. For example, you can have a statement that says, many dentists recommend Colgate toothpaste. That is a true statement, but it doesn't say that Colgate is the number one. It just says many recommend, and statistics can lie. But the thing for me is, I have a question in polling and say to people, do you feel better today than you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago? And in Belize, the answer is no, we don't. So that effect has not come through, that people feel better. So you can get economic growth in a country, but stagnation where it comes to wages.
Yeah.
And then it's up to the government to balance its budget, go through its bureaucracy as to where it's spending money, look at how it gives contracts. And certainly I don't think, again, it's any secret that if you're a crony of the government, you will do well out of contracts.
But can two things be true? Because the government also would always cite the International Monetary Fund, saying that they're not just coming up with this data from their own accord. This comes from the IMF, and then of course the Bulmer report says otherwise. Could two things be true, that the GDP growth is actually showing what is taking place, but the income per capita is saying something else?
You can. Statistics are one of those things that is easy to misinterpret or be selective from.
Okay.
And again, this goes back years. This is nothing new today. But as I've just said, you can have economic growth in a country, but no citizen feels it. And that's where Belize is and has been. And this is what Mr. Bulmer was trying to say, is yes, you may have this growth, and certainly the latest growth is post-COVID, where the economy collapsed and now you're getting back again. So of course there is more growth that comes after such a phenomena as COVID, which smashed the economy of many of the smaller nations to work their way through.
But there's a lot of chest beating that comes along with that, because when you listen to the government of the day, they're touting the fact that Belize's economy is performing extremely well post-COVID and what have you. When you speak to the average person, as you mentioned, they're not feeling it.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, the cost of living is still very much oppressive. People are saying, look, I can't breathe under, heavy prices and what have you. So I don't know wherein lies the true reality of it all, because on one end it seems extreme that the government is saying, look, everything is fine and dandy, but when you talk to the small man can't survive under the circumstances. I would want to think that perhaps somewhere in the middle class has a say.
Yeah.
Well, you've got to bear in mind where politicians are concerned, truth is a moving target. And therefore, to that extent, you've got to get the whole picture into place. You've got to get your democracy right. You can't start moaning and complaining about wages and living conditions when you have a whole political system that needs changing. Yeah. And it's up to the people themselves as to whether they want to attempt to make that change.
You spoke about the wealthy population seeing increase in wealth. And for me, one of the things that I wonder is what could be the long-term implications of that in a country, in a small developing country like ours. We are seeing unions take a stand and fight for their wages. We're seeing the general public support them. Could we potentially see more unrest or an increase in unrest from persons based on feeling that middle class are now becoming lower class persons and the wealthy is simply becoming wealthier?
Well, you will, but this is one of capitalism is the best system in the world for the creation of the economy, but it has its flaws. And one of the flaws is, by definition, it does create inequality. And you have to accept that part of it, that you cannot square that inequality, especially in the world today, where capital is both mobile and personnel are mobile. We are having in the United Kingdom at the moment where millionaires and the rich are flooding out of the United Kingdom because we now have a government that is not only taxing people at a rate that the wealthy will not accept, and they can move. And then you will have an economic problem where who's going to pay the taxes for the welfare?
Yeah.
Because it is the top few people in the Western economies that actually provide the taxation support. In Belize, there is a lot of tax avoidance, where people just don't pay their taxes, and you get the system in which it's difficult to get out of. I mean, for me, I do not know for Belize what the answer is to get the political spectrum correct first.
Let's go in a slightly different direction here and talk about BTL. So there's been rumors, there's been conversation in certain quarters about an interest in this telecoms company acquiring other competitors and of course other media houses as part of this acquisition. What are your thoughts on that? From the perspective of the creation of what seems to be a monopoly, and of course for the overall landscape of telecommunications and media in this country.
I mean, well, first of all, I would have to declare where my interest is in this particular one before I answer the question. SpeedNet, which is one of the companies that is talked about whether it comes in with the cable companies, is majority owned by Waterloo Charitable Trust. And that trust also owns the hospital here, Universal Health Services. Now, competition in the telecommunications changes all the time. If you just cast your mind back, we had a lot of problems here when voice over internet protocol, VoIP, came in. The law here said that was illegal to protect the domestic BTL at the time. But eventually that had to be abandoned because internet, WhatsApp and all the rest of it came in and took the revenue away. And then the telephone companies have to compete on that. Now, where BTL is concerned, the first reaction is, how's this going to affect the consumer? Monopolies, terrible, awful, shouldn't be allowed, is the first reaction. In this particular case, there are some fundamental differences. The monopoly through BTL is owned 95% by the government and the Social Security Board. So whatever happens to BTL and whatever the profits are, low or high, is in control of the government. And the government has many ways of raising taxes. If it gets good dividends from BTL, it doesn't need to raise the rate of income tax or import taxes. It's all part of generating that revenue. And in the future, BTL will be under competitive pressure for things like Starlink, which will be the next thing that comes. So it won't be a monopoly per se. It will be them reorganizing to get into place for this country to compete with the international carriers that come in. And if they're able to, and BTL of course is not the government, and I think the thing that should worry people more than anything else when they try to, if they put something together, is what it costs the government, because BTL will probably be able to raise the finances itself. If it can pay off the debt within a few years, then BTL will come out much stronger. And whatever the charges to the consumer are, will be in government's hands at that particular time. And if they decide that they want low cost here, which they may have to in any event when Starlink and other satellite-based companies come in. But do you want a BTL and a SpeedNet to both go bust and give Starlink the monopoly?
It's interesting that you're mentioning Starlink because when an application was made to the Public Utilities Commission for perhaps license to operate within Belize, it was, as far as I'm understanding, initially turned down, but now with very strict locations where they can access Starlink services and what have you. How do you look at any other third-party player entering this telecommunications industry?
Well, I'm a capitalist, so therefore, to that extent, I welcome it. You know, it goes back in all industries. You know, the days when there were rivers, there were ferrymen, and towns were built at thwarting ferrymen. And all of a sudden, somebody says, well, we can build a bridge across the river. There becomes consequences that the ferrymen lose their jobs. And then the ferrymen and the towns fight. And they say, this is unfair. You need to protect our jobs. And we will have the same here in Belize with the port.
I was just about to go to the port next.
Because if the port gets built with a bulk handling facility and all the rest of it, it'll be very difficult to keep the stevedores on at the same types of terms and conditions they get, and the practices that are there. For efficiency, it has to be a highly mechanized operation. And that'll be interesting to see then the reaction of the stevedores union, and whether they decide to go on strike, become violent, so on and so forth. But that's happened in history when efficiencies, AI is coming in, will take over people's jobs. So this, and we all have to then adapt. And as I mentioned earlier on, just in telecommunications, when VoIP, that was illegal. And those, you mentioned Starlink and the government allowing a certain amount, but eventually that barrier will be broken through. And the government has to answer is, do you want telecommunications in Belize to be virtually totally abandoned because of a low cost and all the rest of it? So this is a situation in which if the government does nothing, they can be rightly criticized. And if they try to do something,
They'll also be.
they're also going to be criticized. But they've got, and life on every front is not about best of choices. And this is where people fail. It's about least worst alternatives. And when you have least worst alternatives, your critics will come out, some well informed and most not informed, but love the sound of their own voices.
Let's go back to the port situation. So we're yet to build a cruise terminal in Belize that would conform to international standards for cruise tourism. We're looking at what was, or what still is, the Port of Belize, now owned by the government. We're looking at Port of Magical Belize, which seems to still want to be in the race to build the first terminal. And Stake Bank, for all intents and purposes, is dead in the water. It's tied up in litigation. Where do you see the future of cruise tourism in Belize, given the existing picture?
I mean, if this wasn't so serious, it would be comical as to what has happened here. I mean, it's nothing short of a disgrace. There has been talk about a cruise terminal for nearly 20 years.
Yeah. And none can materialize.
And none can materialize. Now, before COVID, my group, Waterloo, had put together that we could, in fact, build a cruise terminal and a bulk handling facility, which is fairly essential if we're going to grow exports in Belize. And that was costed out at about 250 million US dollars. And we had all the international capital to be able to do it. Portico raises its head. I don't want to go into who was involved or what the decisions were on that, but I think you can read as to why the Senate inquiry was kicked into touch, that nobody really wanted that to go too far. So you come to your own assumptions on that. And then you had State Bank, which would never really serve the great cruise liners that were coming in. They needed to dock on land, and they talked about a causeway between State Bank, but the environmentalists were up in arms about that.
The manatees.
And so on and so forth. And so eventually, government appears to decide that the port should be exactly where Waterloo was going to build it. They want all Waterloo's IP to be able to copy exactly what. They're going to have to go back through the environmental stuff that they've managed to fix that Waterloo got turned down for. And so then they've got to go out and raise international capital. So if you really think this is going to happen quickly.
Okay. So how do you feel as a businessman who went to great lengths doing all the due diligence to be able to present what would have been a proper and sound proposal to build a cruise terminal exactly where it is at the Port of Belize? The government bats it down through NEAC and all of these other agencies and what have you. They now purchase Port of Belize back from you and are intent on doing the very same thing that you were trying to do in the first place. How do you feel about that?
How do you think? I'll give you 3 guesses.
I don't want to hazard any guess.
Huh?
You'll forgive me.
I think it's self-evident what my response would be to that. However, I am doing my autobiography, and a lot of these things will be explained in full in that autobiography, and a lot of people won't be happy.
Public-private partnerships usually have mixed global impact. And when we see the efforts that have been made, whether successful or ones that have failed, what are lessons you think we could learn here in Belize on how to improve upon that?
Well, many of those that happened in the United Kingdom turned out to be very bad for the taxpayer because they gave away far too much at that particular point. And I haven't really seen where partnerships between government and the private sector are really successful, because you often have the bureaucracy of the private sector clashing with the entrepreneurial spirit of the private sector. It's a bit like socialism. Sounds good in theory, but is useless in practice. And so I'm not a great fan of the private, these types of partnerships.
The PPPs.
The PPPs. Because it's also a way of deferring the cost to the government. And many of them land up, the government's having to take them back again. So it's just be very careful before you enter into those forms of contracts.
So there was a proposal at one point being floated to construct another government complex right adjacent to the existing one on Lake Independence, which would have been a public-private partnership as well. And I don't know that that has gotten off the ground in terms of the buy-in from those in the private sector, but perhaps you're right. Maybe the business people are a bit skeptical of entering into that kind of a covenant with the public sector.
I mean, I think if you get things right, you can be entrepreneurial about things, but I believe that government should be less in the business sector rather than more. So I'm against things like nationalization, but it sounds good, the public owns something. But the problem is that it's very difficult then to find the right management who have the incentive, because you can't incentivize them by giving them shares in something. You can't You can't pay them significantly greater than civil servants, and it's difficult for the state to run big businesses efficiently.
All right, well, we are enjoying the conversation, at least the first half of it so far. We do have to take a quick break, though, and when we come back, we are going to switch over into some international conversations, and of course, where Belize lies in that as well. Don't go anywhere. OIE continues after the break.